I tell you what, I just heard about this morning. In fact, I was just having a cup of coffee and a piece of toast in front of breakfast TV. Was Macclesfield Town, the sort of rebirth of Macclesfield Town? Have you heard about that, Gary? About Robbie Savage is involved. Have I got that right, Robbie? Yeah, I have you.
Yeah.
And a local businessman has come in to rescue a club that was otherwise going to go under, because of COVID and a couple of bad years that have gone on before that. But one of the things I thought was really amazing in that is this instant sense of community spirit that got behind this club. You know, they had the same guy cutting the grass has been there for years, and he's been up there on the payroll for the last couple of days, or taking risks that he might get paid. And you know how football in that little community is just spurning a rebirth in so much more than the sport itself. Did you see that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And I started, I finished as a player and started my coaching career almost at Burton Albion. So sort of similar size club really. And I think what people, everything's about the glitz and the razzmatazz of the Premier League and football. And people see that as the main part of football. But, when you go down to these clubs, it means so much to the communities, doesn't it? And there's so many people. I mean, I remember at Burton, there was a lady there. It was a tea lady. I won't make her too famous by mentioning her name, but she'd been working for free. She'd been working voluntarily for about 40 years. And it's incredible how many people do that at these levels. So like you say, I mean, when a club's in trouble, a lot of it's almost like if a club's struggling results wise, maybe there's less empathy. But as soon as a club almost goes out of business, that whole community rallies round, and it's almost, in some ways, it's probably just as exciting to restart it and remodel it and get it going again. I played with Robbie Savage at Leicester, so that will be an interesting leadership experiment, I think, with Robbie helping. But he's a passionate guy, he loves his football.
He really that really came across this morning. He was so excited about it.
Yeah, he does. Look, I mean, I'm sure that financially he's not doing it for that side of it. He's doing it probably to give something back to that area, and he's doing something because he's passionate about it. And for me, that's just as much what football's about in this country than the top 6 clubs that we're talking about at the moment, trying to do deals to help out the lower league clubs. So it is really interesting, like you say, how people galvanise and try and inspire that little bit of hope when the back's against the wall a little bit. Very, very typical of the sort of not just the British spirit. I don't mean that, but that is what we're synonymous with, aren't we?
Exactly.
I tell you what it reminds me of, just very quickly. You just put a sort of tea and medals type memory into my head when I was, because I did a little bit of time with the Household Cavalry in my early military career, but I was in Germany. And we were trucking around on tanks all the time, And there's this training area in northern Germany, which military people who watch this podcast will remember. It's called Soltau, which is basically a sort of morass of mud that goes for acres and acres and acres. And you go up there to train, drive your tanks around, and most of the time you spend broken down because the tanks can't get through the mud, or the engineers can't get to you, or anything like that. And that's terrible sort of indictment on our fantastic professional armored corps. But it was amazing. You always used to mass for a final attack on this hill in Soltau, and there would be a progression of tanks breaking down throughout this, or getting stuck in the mud or anything like that. But always, there was this guy called Wolfgang who drove a transit van across the same mud, just with a T-bar. And every time we did that attack, he was there right on the objective to service everyone that just sort of had just done the attack, wanted a cup of tea and a sort of bratwurst or something like that. And it just goes down to show you these individuals, they play such a great part in our culture, don't they?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, absolutely.
Well, you can make a lot of money following British soldiers around with a hot tea ready to go. That's for sure. Gary, great to have you on. And I think I want to place just a mental marker in that topic of conversation. We have to discuss COVID and the impact of it on the game. And I think perhaps the impact on those local communities is probably most keenly felt when you move away from, as you say, the glitz of the Premier League. So let's definitely return to that. But I'd love you to take us back to before you joined Millwall, and take us through the decision-making process that you went through before you accepted the offer. And then after you joined, what were your immediate priorities?
Yeah, I think I'd been out of work for 9 months. I'd looked and had some opportunities, but it was always for me around. I'd left the club previous to that where things hadn't gone well. There was lots of issues. It had been a Premier League club for 10 years, and then it'd come out of the Premier League, and of course you've got a lot of players that perhaps did well. You had about 9 or 10 players that straight away said they didn't want to be there. You had quite a lot of staff that were still talking about when we're in the Premier League, and it was a real difficult scenario to change culture. But I learned an awful lot, and that's how I've always tried to view any job. It's about what you learn and how you take that forward and make yourself better and be better prepared for the next opportunity. So it was always in my mind that I wanted a club with a real humility that knew what it was. That was really, really important to me, that I felt, it was trying to me to be honest and felt that I worked really well with players that perhaps are less better paid, that have a real desire to want to work hard and I can maybe shape them in the way and help them to perform better and be a better team. So that was my remit, really. I waited and waited. I had a couple of opportunities that were quite interesting, but deep down I knew they weren't really right. Nevertheless, you could try and convince. I think when you're out of work, you try and convince yourself somehow that those opportunities are okay and you'll be able to turn it around. But I had one that was very similar to the one I'd left, and thankfully it didn't come up and I didn't get the job. I probably would have took it, but I didn't get it. And then the Millwall opportunity came up, and ironically, it was actually, it's a really, really strange situation. I have to say it was incredible leadership of some kind from the previous manager. So Neil had felt, Neil Harris was the manager previous to me. He felt as though he took it. He was a player there. He was a legend there. Done brilliantly as a manager, but felt as though maybe he'd taken it as to a level where he not running out of ideas, but felt as though maybe it needed some fresh ideas. And he actually resigned. And a couple of days after he resigned, he rang me and said, "Would you be interested in the job?" He said, "I think you'd be ideal. I'd like to put your name forward." And I felt, what an incredible way to look at things. And normally most people in that situation would step aside and almost not think about the club and not think about what was right for it. But I thought that was really inspiring for someone like that to at least put somebody else forward in his place. And
why do you think he called you, Gary? What was his reasoning for calling you specifically?
Well, I knew Neil. I'd done a pro license course with Neil, and obviously I come across him as a player and manager previously to that, and maybe I don't know. It might have been that he called other people as well and was just trying to do the right thing for the club. But I think he probably felt as though stylistically, I would be a good fit for Millwall. It's a real, from a playing culture, it's a very gritty area. It's the fans. I'm talking years and years ago. It's Dockers. It's a very, very industrial area along the Thames, and of course the club was north of the river originally and moved south of the river. So there's a real history and toughness about the club, and maybe he felt as though the way we played and the previous jobs that I'd done would maybe be suitable for this club, and because I've had probably 3 or 4 clubs experience, maybe felt I could bring something different. But as soon as it was interesting because it wasn't your obvious club to take. It was a club that maybe haven't got a massive budget. It was a club that certainly as a manager you knew wasn't going to be the top paid money you were ever going to get. But it wasn't about that. It was about the culture, and it was about going somewhere where they're not trying to be something they're not. They know what they are. They know what they want. I'm talking about the fans and the club, and there was a real unity there. So it was a really interesting way to almost be introduced to the opportunity to get the job. And then of course I had to then go through the whole process of being interviewed, and then a second interview, and trying to shape ideas of what we felt we could do going into the club. And it was actually a very extensive interview process, probably more extensive than anywhere I'd ever been. It was actually very helpful because it made me look insightfully into the club and probably prepared me in a better way when I went in.
That point about culture, Gary, is something I know Reece and I picked up on after we talked to you last week. It's a fascinating culture that you've come into, And quite often in football, I think the culture between the fans and the culture between the players, especially if you look at the Premier League and there's rock star players going on, can sometimes get separated. I think what you're saying is it's really important to keep those two things connected if you can. How are you going to go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, we've been there probably a year now, and the challenge was always to try to move the team forward in the way that I and my staff feel is the best way to be successful. Of course, we want to get in the Premier League. For me, when I came in, there was almost a side culture. I remember beating a team early on, and we had some of the directors came in afterwards, and they were looking at the results on the TV, and they were looking at the results of all the bottom teams in the division. So they were still subliminally thinking about maybe not being dragged down into those areas. And for me, it was interesting. We tried to change that culture. We tried to make it very aspirational. Why can't we be challenged? All I want to do is look up. Listen, we're reining teams in and we're dragging them in and we're trying to overtake them. I'm not even looking down, because for me, we're better than that. And, obviously we have to prove we're better than that in the way we work every day and play. But it was just trying to change the cycle of what they were looking to achieve. And that was very interesting. Obviously, then results have to come with it, because like anything, if you don't get results as a leader, if you like, then people are probably less inclined to follow your ideas. I think it always gives it a little bit of credence if you can start winning games and people see results coming with what you're asking them to do. But the
sort of operating culture that you've got in the business of the club, of course, and then there's the local culture of the people that have been associated with the club for a long time. How do you know when you've got that right? What's the sort of signals that you get from the fans? I mean, obviously difficult at the moment. Perhaps we could discuss that a little bit more later on. But how do you know when you've got that culture match?
Yeah, it's quite an easy way of measuring it. Usually, you get booed by 20,000 fans every Saturday. It's a very strange feedback loop for a manager. It's not one that I would recommend to most people. But yeah, no, I think you gauge it in different ways. I think obviously any fan wants to see certain elements from their team. They want to see their team winning, but they appreciate that they're not going to win every game. They want to see that incredible. I think most fans want to see their passion for their club reflected in the players' performances. I think most people want to see that in people that work with them or for them or any team. You want to see your teammates just as passionate as you are. You want to see people, who are, they might be not as talented. It's really interesting because obviously for you guys will probably know more about it than me, but I looked at something recently and it was almost like a military sort of scale, if you like, and it was around trust and skill set and which would you take? Would you take the someone who's maybe a 10 in skill and a 1 in trust? Say that maybe you'd rather.
I think it was the Simon Sinek thing, wasn't it, when he was doing the graph?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And it was really interesting. I'm not saying that necessarily you would choose people just on that alone. Obviously, there'd be far more factors, but it was really interesting. And I think there's an element of that at a club like Millwall where, we haven't necessarily got that individual brilliance to win games all the time. So we have to be a team. We have to be a very, very strong unit, and everyone has to be trusted to do their jobs. And with that, I think we're quite a formidable opponent to teams.
Nice.
Gary, you alluded to it just a moment ago. I think one of the greatest tensions that all leaders have to contend with is that between short-term and long-term success. How does that manifest itself within football management and you specifically, and how do you cope with that?
Yeah, the short-term goal. I think the short-term goal for me is not just about winning games of football. It's about trying to maximize the potential of the players and the group, and that's how I've always seen it. I've tried to follow a performance cycle that takes away losing and winning, and allows those emotional kind of highs and lows to shape the way you work during the week. For me, it's about consistency. It's about believing in what you do and trying to follow that pattern and pathway. And I think that helps the players also. Long term, it's really difficult at a club like ours because, in some ways, a manager's job is to get the best team on the pitch, to a certain degree at all costs, because you've got to try and win games and be aspirational. But at a club like Millwall, I don't think you can ever, I'm sure if I pushed the owner now, I could probably sign a player that maybe was more expensive than we'd really want to sign. And then I think we're taking the culture down a different direction. We might be more successful initially, but I think long term there's that real balance, and it's a real dichotomy for me of how far do you take the club financially into an area where maybe it creates a little bit of instability for the club, especially in times like this. We talk a lot about clubs in lower leagues or clubs being under threat because of a lack of income. And I think you have to, from a leadership point of view, you have to have that moral responsibility also, not just to do what's right for you to be successful and the team. It's also about what the club needs and the culture needs, and how can you maybe shape that long term and not be so greedy initially, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And can I ask if you've ever experienced that tension played out between the manager, or perhaps just seen it between the manager and the ownership of the club, whereby perhaps one party is asking for something else, and then the other party thinks that that's the wrong course of action, and how is that dynamic managed?
Yeah, I've had that a lot. I mean, I've had it at previous clubs where I've had it where new owners have come in, and from their culture, it's almost been, we're going to spend loads of money. We're going to get you this, we're going to get you that, we're going to get, and I've gone, that's fine, but there's a lot of people here that have worked incredibly hard that, in my opinion, you should reward the people first before we start, extravagantly kind of, creating new pitches or creating more facilities. And, for me, it's always about rewarding people along the way. If you've got a player on, £1,000 a week who's been working incredibly hard and got a team to maybe 8th, you can't then bring a player in on £10,000 a week and expect the others to feel the same way. So for me, you have to drag everything with you if you're going to try and be successful and reward as well. So I've had different scenarios. I've also had different scenarios where the owners of the club, won't see, are so proud of their club that they won't see certain areas that are obvious problems. And as a manager going in, you're always in a really difficult scenario where, it's a lot easier to get rid of the manager financially than it is to get rid of all the players and all the staff. So there's always that balance of how I've always, for my, probably why I've left some jobs and maybe not had that longevity that I'd like in some of the jobs, is because I've always tried to be honest. I've always felt as though, I'd rather just say it how it is rather than think about how I can survive in the job for a certain amount of time. Because for me, it's going to come to a head at some point. So I think there's always that time that maybe you need to bring it to a head and just say it how it is. I don't know whether that's always the right. Maybe that's something I'm learning. That maybe that's not always the right thing.
I think what you're talking, if I'm hearing you right, Gary, is you're talking. There's a high element of risk which you have to manage. There's an amazing amount of trust, and there is an amazing amount of accountability, and that's resting on your shoulders. I shouldn't have needed reminding that your ultimate accountability is those booing fans.
Yes,
maybe I can just switch on to those fans at the moment, because of course we are in extraordinary times for football at the moment, and there
absolutely
are playing in a stadium that's covered in posters rather than fans, and it must have been a really interesting debate about how stadiums would be dressed up without fans when we went into this phase of sport. But more interestingly, I think in the last couple of weeks, there's been some really interesting results in all the leagues at the moment, where there's some sort of giant killing examples. Do you think that do you think that the lack of fans, the lack of atmosphere in stadiums, and I think there's lots we can take from, all leaders can take from this, because it's the context in which you operate. Do you think that's had a massive effect on the actual outcome of some of the games that have been played in the last few weeks?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it has to have a massive effect. If all of a sudden you're playing in front of 20,000 fans You get the highs and the lows of the game. You strategize to try to create some of those moments of atmosphere. You want to start the game well and get your home fans, passion elevated early on, so you can play a certain way to try and enforce that. Late on in the game, you can chase games if you're losing, and you can create atmospheres and 10 minutes, 15 minutes where the opposition are under pressure because of the noise levels and all of that. Now you have none of that. You can't. Yeah. We looked at lots and lots of ways because in my opinion, my job's to try and give the players the best possible chance of winning games. So we looked at crowd noise. We looked at the cardboard crowds. We looked at the all sorts of things. And I think some of that was to try and help the fans at least feel engaged when they're not there. But I think that's very difficult. I think what we found is it's the game almost feels like nothing without the crowds and the fans. And for someone like me, it didn't. I was always a fan as a kid, but I always played football. I mean, I lived on the Isle of Wight. I didn't really have any professional football teams there, so I wasn't a fan of a specific team, and went every Saturday with my dad and understood that psychology. And for me, it's been really interesting because you just understand just like with the clubs are nothing without their fan base.
The power of the community that surrounds the club, I imagine, is just really tough. It's really tough, and we see sort of on the news people going out to outside stadiums to sort of try and be closer to the game and things like that.
Yeah.
How does that, if I could just ask a follow-up question, how does that affect leadership on and off the pitch? Have you had to adjust your approach, and have your players in leadership positions on the pitch had to adjust the way they lead the team?
I don't think so. I think the only adjustment is really there's just a greater responsibility to do that. I mean, I think what I would say is our group are unbelievable for that. That I've never seen a dressing room culture that leads itself so well. At every other club, any disciplinary problem, I've had to find players, or I've had to discipline them, or I've had to deal with it. At Millwall, I've not had one moment where I've had to deal with anything in-house. They have their own rules, they have their own culture. And I have to say, it's the strongest and most efficient and impressive culture I've seen from an internal dressing room. And what that then does is that leads out onto the pitch. You have a lot of, we have leadership groups, but in some ways we don't need to almost hand select leadership groups and make it feel perhaps not as real, or maybe a little bit forced. They do it themselves.
So you're reinforcing rather than changing the positive elements of the leadership that's in the club. Great, fantastic.
Yeah, I think you're reinforcing their role because all of a sudden there's no fans, so it's up to them to almost incite that passion in each other during the game. Because you haven't got those, like I said, you haven't got those natural highs in the game. So it's about mentality. We don't play the game to get. We do, but we don't play the game to get cheered off the fans. We play the game because we want to win. That's why we all came into football. So for me, it's a bigger challenge, but it's certainly going to be a fascinating social experiment on team sports and no fans, and why some of the results are why they are.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Gary.
Gary, when you first started at the club, and you started to realise that the culture among the players was as you've just described, a little bit different, where there was that natural leadership there that perhaps didn't exist anywhere else. How did you explain that to yourself? Like, why does that exist? Is it a few players that have been there for a while that are bringing everyone else on? Is it the connection with the community? What is it you think makes it different?
I think to a certain degree, I think first and foremost, it's always comes down, well, in my opinion, it always comes down to people. So it always comes down to, we have 3 or 4, probably more than that, but we have 3 or 4 strong characters in the dressing room that I think they sense that we're not a club that's going to go out and spend lots and lots of money. They sense that we haven't got the best facilities. And they know what the club's about. But with that almost comes such a great humility. People are there because they want to be there to win games and be part of a team. And I think also the previous management would recruited good characters. That was almost a remit. If you're not a good character, no matter how good you are as a player, we're not going to take you. So I think we came into a very, very strong group. And I think they'd had some issues previously as well that maybe reinforced how they recruited, but but it's really interesting. I think I almost had to observe and learn and speak to those people to gauge how good it was. I mean, it's incredible. They one of the things that they do is every player has a job. So every player's got a job, a responsibility to the point where it's ridiculous. I was speaking to one player the other day, and his job's to make sure that the TV in the canteen never goes off. So it's so ridiculous, but the point is it gives that player a responsibility of an importance of something that maybe doesn't look that important to anyone else. And there's 25 players, so you can imagine, they have a little bit of fun with it, and they use it for a little bit of humour as well. But I have to say, it's a brilliant place to be. And at some places I've walked in, and some days, like any person in a position of leadership, some days you're normal. You go in and you think, not looking forward to today. I don't know why. I'm just not looking. Every day I've gone into Millwall, I've enjoyed, and every day I've looked forward to getting into work, which I think is testament to the culture that the players, not us, the players have created themselves.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. And there's a saying that goes, how you do anything is how you do everything, right? So you give someone a small task, and they execute that task with precision. They take care, whether it be making sure the TV's on or something material a bit more important, but it just embeds this level of excellence and care, I think, into how you go about your business.
Yeah, and I don't think it's even come off the back of, if I look at the people involved, I don't think they've studied cultures. I don't think they've studied, maybe they've looked at things like the All Blacks and sweeping the sheds and that humility. But I think it's just a natural humility, and a natural humility, as maybe just, they maybe started with a few ideas. One thing actually, even just talking about it, it'd probably be very interesting for me at some point to pull the players involved and say, what started it? What made you do this? Because actually, it's something that we don't really discuss. It's just done by the players, and we don't really get involved too much with, because it's not, it's their responsibility, and I like that. But it would actually be interesting to sit down with them and say, what, how did this start? What kind of, what bore these ideas, and whose idea were they, and was it a collective? But yeah, it would be fascinating.
I think there's something in that, Gary, and there's definitely something about people sort of surrendering their own personal preferences, personal behaviours to something that generates a higher purpose. And I think it sounds like you've absolutely got that at the club. And Reece and I, when we talk to clients, we talk about strategy alignment is what we call it. Not just being everyone sees the vision statement, passed it on the wall. It means that everyone knows how exactly everything that they do contributes towards that vision, and that's where everyone's going. It's so important. It sounds like you have a really healthy alignment of that at the club. Let me take you to the sort of the first minutes of the game. Everything's been prepared. The guys step across the white line, and then you've got to empower them. You've got to let them go. How does that? Just talk us through how that feels, and how from preparation you go to the game, and what are the differences in levels of control? Because I think that would be a great insight for anyone listening. And do you have any particular techniques or observations that helps people through that moment?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Of course, it's all about the preparation during the week and making sure that when the players go out there, from a physiological perspective, for me, it's about, they have to know what they've got to do, but you have to almost leave them a little bit free to go and perform that on the pitch, and not stifle them with too much information and inhibit the way that they play. So I think it's all about the preparation during the week. We have a game plan before we when we meet at 1:30 for a 3:00 kickoff on a Saturday. So we'll give them that game plan and just reinforce the things we spoke about, and they'll be part of that game plan to a certain degree. And then the last thing I try to say to the players is just something I've learned over the years, really, but I don't think any big, Churchillian speeches really necessarily work, because we're playing twice a week. I think if it was a one-off event, then maybe so. But so it's almost just, how can I try and affect their psychology before they go out? What can I say, the last little words, and how can I deliver them effectively? And then I think when you played it, it's a really strange feeling, because when you play the game, when you stood on the sideline, I think from the moment the game kicks off, there is an initial feeling of kind of not helplessness, but you've lost. You have to almost give control to the players now, and you can't really do an awful lot about it. And it's something that you have to learn to deal with and have to strategize a little bit of how you do it. So and then all I then try to focus on during that half is what can I do at half time to help the players in the second period. Obviously, if I have to give information on how can that information be effective to that player, and maybe not giving too much information. It's different at the moment because obviously there's no fans, so you can impart that information a little bit easier than in a noisy stadium. But nevertheless, you don't want to be constantly talking to the players all game. So it is a strange feeling, and I think that's how you do it. You have to prepare. You then see if you can affect them that last moments before going out, and then it's about concentrating on what can I do rather than just getting emotionally involved in the game. And I think there's a thing called the frustration aggression hypothesis that I read about. But it's interesting for me. What I tend to do is if we're losing, I start berating the fourth official all the time. If I'm winning, I never do it, and I have to stop myself because as soon as I start doing that, I'm not focusing on how I can help the players on the pitch. And so from my point of view, it's about trying to control that frustration if the game's not going how I would like it to go, and just trying to think about how I can help the team change that, I suppose.
I think it's one of the biggest challenges that all leaders face. Stan McChrystal talks about it as part of the team of teams model that we help organizations implement. Creating that empowered execution, it just creates all kinds of turmoil in your head as you it's the right thing to do to relinquish control, but it is so difficult to do, especially as you said, when things aren't perhaps going your way. I'd like to turn to the topic of risk, if we can. Matthew Syed in the Times last week wrote a really interesting article on risk taking in sport. What is your personal appetite for risk? How does that play out within the team? And when you perhaps might have different players with different appetites for risk, how do you guide them to what you think is an appropriate approach to risk taking?
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic because from my own personal perspective, I'm not naturally a risk taker. I'm a very kind of not reserved, but I'm very much I have to think it. I have to rationalize it. I'm not somebody who can necessarily. And I'm not necessarily saying you have to see risk in that way. Because I suppose it can still be a very considered risk. I think football's a challenge because you want the players to take risks in the right areas. So the obvious part of football is when you're attacking, you want players to be able to take risks. When they're defending, you perhaps want them to be a little bit more considered in the way they make those decisions. But we have probably 2 or 3 players in our team, and we have one player in particular that almost needs to feel he can take those risks, and he needs to feel that he can have a little bit less responsibility in some ways for some of the other factors of the game. And for me, it's always about the players that you could think can affect the game at the right end of the pitch, i.e. scoring goals and that final third. It's about empowering them to take the risks. The way I always view risk for a player is I always view the risk as, listen, let me take responsibility for it. You do it, and if it fails, it's my fault. It's not your fault. It's my fault because I'm asking you to do it. And that way, I almost try to take, because risk is funny in football. Again, if you've got 20,000 fans there, you take a risk and lose the ball, those fans are going to give you an incredible instant feedback. And so therefore the player might feel next time, if I take that risk again and I get booed, then the risk is not as great as, or great as a reward. So I think sometimes you have to take that away from the player. And that's how I try to do it. I try to say, listen, you do what you're good at. I'll give you the areas and the tools to try and do that. And then I'll take responsibility for it. And then I think within that, I have to make sure that I'm consistent with that. There's no point a player doing it, making a mistake, and then me berating in front of the rest of the team. I have to then be consistent in the way that I do it.
Just on that feedback, Gary. Yes, there's the instant feedback of the crowd reaction, which I imagine is incredibly powerful, and not something that is very easy to prepare for. And there aren't many people who can actually give advice on that because it is such a unique thing. With over the last 10 years, with social media coming in, and that feedback from the fans and the media just coming in constantly the entire time, how do players deal with that, and what effect does it have on them?
I think it has a bigger effect than people would probably realise. I mean, I don't, from a personal point of view, I mean, I have children that I've got, on social media, so I'm aware of it. I don't do it personally because I feel as though, if you're going to, I think people do it it's like anything, isn't it? People do it because they get that instant gratification of good feedback. But I think the problem then is, unless you can deal with bad feedback and how it works. And as we know, like in those sort of technologies, it's faceless. People will say things on social media that they wouldn't say to your face, and therefore it becomes very irrational and a little bit pack-led. So particularly in football, it's difficult. To a certain degree, I don't know how the players deal with it. It's not something I necessarily talk to them about, but I think a lot of players have to find their own solution. The thing I always say to players, if you go on social media, you have to be prepared for far more negativity than positivity, because that's just the way, unfortunately, it's sad, but I think that's the way society works. People are far easier to hand out a negative comments than they are to hand out compliments. Not for everybody, but I think that's just the nature of social media. So it is a big challenge for players. It's a big challenge for anybody in that environment. And my only question for players is how can you keep that even keeler performance if you're always looking at that feedback? We try to use it a different way. So my argument is we're working with different players to maybe who I played with 20 years ago. So players want feedback. Players use their phones and technology to get that feedback. So we try to give them a lot of their performance feedback via their phone instantly. An hour after the game. What did their match stats look like? What were their clip? We give them some of that. And what we'll try and also do is we can also shape that how we want. So, we can make that maybe 70, 80% positive, 20% things to work on. And I think, that's the area we live in. So for me, it's about how can we make that a positive thing rather than necessarily a negative thing. But it must be difficult to deal with. I don't know how, even a manager on social media, how would you do it? Because you're there to be shot at.
Yeah, I think what you've hit on there, Gary, and maybe people don't realise quite much that when we talk about empowering people, we don't just talk about saying you have my authority to get on with it, but you also need the training, you need the skills, you need the resources, and you need to be delegated that authority so that you feel that you have it. And just to go back to Reece mentioned Stan McChrystal, he has a saying when he was commanding the special forces in Iraq and Afghanistan: if you get there and the mission we gave you was wrong, execute the mission we should have given you, which is sort of ultimate empowerment. It sounds like you're doing the same sort of thing. But what I've really picked on from that last conversation that we've just had is that there are different pieces of that puzzle, and social media must be another one. It's interesting to see that you're adapting to that aspect of the game. The game, as an observer of the game over the last sort of 5 years, I think has fundamentally changed, and it's fundamentally changed in so many ways for the better. The magic moments of the last World Cup, especially for any England fans, were absolutely transformational. But there's other things going on. There's a huge increased popularity in the last couple of years from women's football, and I'd be interested to find out how you interact with the Millwall ladies team. How that's going at the moment, and what do you think there's more effort that can be done to promote that? What are your thoughts on the two elements of the club now?
Yeah, I think every club wants to promote all types of football and all opportunities for your whole community and for everyone to be involved. I mean, we have a Lionesses team that we don't necessarily have. We have quite a close relationship, I think, within the community, not necessarily with the first team, because I think one of the challenges we have at the moment we're on a separate site to the academy, and obviously the Lionesses would train at a different site as well. We're looking at the moment of ways of changing that. So from a cultural perspective, we can all come together a little bit more. We've just done a CPD event for all the academy coaches to try and get a flavour of how the first team maybe want to play and how we want to work, so at least they can have an understanding of it, trying to bring young players through. And and one of the coaches from the Lionesses was there also. So we've had that opportunity to share ideas, and that's something we want to try and do moving forward. We want to almost have a little bit of a coaches hub, so we come together and share ideas and get to know each other a little bit better. Because I think any culture, like you say, it's a challenge when you're not in the same building. It's a challenge when you're not seeing each other all the time. And certainly from a football perspective, a lot of the men's first teams take a lot of credence, but certainly there's a huge importance in all the teams at your football club and how that culture then aligns down throughout the organisation.
Yeah. I think that's really important. I think there's always something you can learn from those different aspects, or we call them silos in an organisation that sort of have looked after themselves previously. But if you do get that sort of ability to share information, you never know when you're going to learn something really useful. Every day's a school day. Absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
Gary, one of the biggest impacts that the pandemic has had within organisations is in the engagement of employees. Everyone now a lot of people now working remotely. You mentioned earlier about engagement of the fans, and you've tried certain things in the stadium to help keep the fans engaged. There's the obvious impact and separation now physically between the game and the fans. What are the fans saying to you and the club, and what are you trying to implement to make sure that engagement stays high?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite ironic, really, but as a football club, I won't go into too much detail, but as a football club, you're allowed your fans on a match day to sit in the lounges and watch the game on the TV, but you're not allowed to go outside and watch it. So it's quite bizarre, really. But I think, as a club, we're just trying to find, I suppose from an organisation perspective, which won't be my remit necessarily, but trying to engage the fans in any way they can. We need the fans. We need to keep them part of what we're doing, and we're talking about maybe not having fans till next March. So that will be a year without our fans. I mean, that's just an incredible time period that you never thought would ever happen. I know we're going through challenges that a lot of organisations are going through. From my point of view, every time I speak to the media, I think the challenge is to try and create some messages for the fans, because I've spoke probably every game about how the game's very different without our fans with us, how we need our fans back, how it is vitally important for a small, I wouldn't say small club, but a club like Millwall, a very community-based club where the fans are so important. I spoke to teams from I spoke to players from other teams, and they've always said, Millwall is such a difficult place to go, such a hostile environment. It's an old-fashioned club in terms of the facilities, and it's an intimidating mix, and that wins you games alone. We haven't got that now, so we have to find a way to cope. But certainly, we don't want our fans to feel as though they're not part of what we're trying to do, because I think that's the danger at the moment. Is there's such a separation. But it's hard to keep people engaged when they can't come and watch what they've been doing for probably 40, 50 years, or their families have been doing for virtually 100 years. It's incredible, really. But I think we're trying our best.
That's so important, and I think that's a fantastic place to close. And the reason I'm smiling slightly is because I'm going to have to explain this to my father-in-law, who's a lifelong West Ham supporter.
Oh, I wouldn't have done this. I wouldn't have done this had I known that.
I know. Well, we couldn't tell you until the last bit of the conversation, but I'm not even sure if I'll be still in the will by the end of today. So
no, possibly not.
What a great conversation. I think one of the things we do, what Reece and I do when we talk to large organisations, is we try to say to them that if you can mirror the behaviours of high-functioning small teams into a large organisation, you will win in the new normal, I suppose, in the new environment where so much change, so much complexity really makes people struggle. And I think what you've given us an example of is two things. One is that those behaviours are alive and well at Millwall Football Club, and we wish you the very best for the rest of the season. And I know you've done so much to come through these difficult times, first of all. But also, I think it's great for people who might listen to this podcast from big organisations to track back to what those behaviours are, and you've aptly demonstrated that, so that you get that level of empowerment on the day, in the moment, as the guys cross the line. and you know, from both of us, I know from me perspective, from me personally, sorry, I wish you the very best of success for the rest of the season. Thanks so much for talking to us today. It's been
great. Really enjoyed it.
Really insightful. Thanks, mate.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Gary.
Very much.
Thank you all for listening to TM Medals, and looking forward to seeing you back here next time.